The 15th of January, 1947. Los Angeles was busy with its usual routines. In a quiet neighborhood, a mother was walking with her child. It was an ordinary morning until she noticed something unusual on the ground. At first, it looked like a mannequin lying near the sidewalk, but as she got closer, she realized it wasn't. It was the lifeless body of a young woman. What she saw was horrifying. The woman's body was cut in half at the waist, with no sign of blood around it. Her face had deep slashes, giving the appearance of a disturbing, unnatural smile. It was clear that whoever had done this had gone to great lengths to cause harm. The mother ran to get help, and soon the police arrived. Investigators quickly determined that the victim wasn't killed where she was found. Her body had been carefully placed there, arranged in a specific way, almost as if someone wanted it to be seen. The young woman was later identified as Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress. She had dreams of making a name for herself in Hollywood. Instead, her name would be remembered for a crime that shocked the entire country. The media gave her a nickname, the Black Dahlia. It was inspired by her love for wearing black clothes and a movie that was popular at the time. The crime scene left investigators with more questions than answers. Who could have done something so brutal? Why would someone target Elizabeth? The police launched a massive investigation, and even the FBI got involved. They worked tirelessly, checking fingerprints, interviewing suspects, and chasing leads. But as time went on, the case grew colder. The Black Dahlia case became one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. Even today, over 75 years later, the mystery remains. Who killed Elizabeth Short and why? The answers may never be found. But the story continues to capture attention and raise questions. It was a little before 11 a.m. on the 15th of January, 1947, in a quiet neighborhood of Los Angeles. The morning air was still and the streets were calm. A mother was walking with her 3-year-old child along Norton Avenue when she saw something unusual lying in the grass near the sidewalk. At first glance, it looked like a discarded mannequin pail, unmoving and out of place. But as she moved closer, the horrifying truth became clear. The lifeless body of a young woman lay on the ground, severed cleanly in half at the waist. Her upper torso was positioned with her arms raised above her head, while her lower half was placed a few inches away, legs spread apart. The body had been drained of blood, leaving the skin pale and stark against the grass. The precision of the cuts was shocking, almost surgical. What was most disturbing was the victims' faces, slashed from ear to ear in a chilling, distorted smile. The mother stumbled back in shock, pulling her child away and running to find help. Police arrived on the scene quickly, but they were met with a sight unlike anything they had encountered before. The crime scene was meticulously cleaned. There was no blood, no obvious evidence, nothing to indicate that the murder had occurred there. It was clear that the victim had been killed elsewhere and carefully placed in this spot. The officers worked to secure the area, but word of the discovery spread fast. Before long, reporters and photographers crowded the scene, snapping pictures and gathering details before the investigation had even begun. The police struggled to maintain control, frustrated by the media's interference. Investigators began piecing together what they could. The victim was a young woman in her early 20s, but she carried no identification. Her physical description: a petite figure, light brown hair dyed black, and distinct facial features was noted. Detectives knew this case would require help from outside agencies, so they contacted the FBI to identify her through fingerprints. Within just 56 minutes, the FBI matched the prints to a woman named Elizabeth Short. She had 2 prior records in their database from a job application at an Army base commissary in 1943, and another from an underage drinking arrest in Santa Barbara later that year. The police now had a name to go with the body, but the questions had only just begun. The neighborhood where Elizabeth's body was found was ordinary, a place where families lived and children played. It seemed an unlikely location for a crime so brutal. But the fact that her body had been placed so publicly suggested that whoever committed the murder wanted it to be found. This was no random act of violence. The killer had gone to great lengths to stage the scene, leaving no obvious clues behind. The discovery marked the start of what would become one of the most infamous investigations in Los Angeles history. Detectives combed through the area, interviewing neighbors and searching for witnesses. Despite their efforts, no one had seen anything unusual that morning. The lack of evidence at the scene left investigators with little to work with, and the clean, precise nature of the crime hinted at a level of skill and planning that was chilling. The gruesome discovery of Elizabeth Short's body sent shockwaves through the city. The details were so unsettling that they made headlines across the nation. As police continued their investigation, the public became captivated by the case. Who was Elizabeth Short, and what could have led to her violent death? For the detectives on the case, solving this murder wasn't just about justice, it was about unraveling one of the most disturbing crimes they had ever encountered. Elizabeth Short was born on the 29th of July, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She grew up in a working-class family as one of 5 daughters. Her father, Cleo Short, owned a successful miniature golf business, but the family's life took a turn during the Great Depression. In 1930, Cleo disappeared, leaving behind his abandoned car, which led everyone to believe he had taken his own life. The sudden loss changed the course of Elizabeth's childhood. Years later, Cleo resurfaced, alive and living in California. By then, Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, had been raising her daughters alone, working hard to make ends meet. Elizabeth's early years were marked by struggles, but those close to her described her as a sweet, shy girl with a vivid imagination and a love for movies. Like many young women of her time, Elizabeth dreamed of escaping her small-town life and finding fame and fortune in Hollywood. Elizabeth was known for her striking beauty. She had pale skin, dark hair, and green eyes that seemed to captivate everyone who met her. But beneath her glamorous appearance, Elizabeth faced her own challenges. She suffered from respiratory issues throughout her life and even underwent surgery to treat chronic bronchitis. Because of her health problems, she spent winters in warmer climates, which eventually led her to California. In the early 1940s, Elizabeth's life took her to various cities. She spent time in Florida, where she worked odd jobs, and eventually made her way to California, reconnecting with her father Cleo. Their reunion, however, was brief and tense. Elizabeth's relationship with her father was strained, and she soon left to start her life on her own. Elizabeth's ultimate goal was to break into Hollywood. She moved to Los Angeles in the mid-1940s, chasing dreams of becoming a movie star. She immersed herself in the glamour of the city, often frequenting nightclubs and socializing with aspiring actors and producers. Though she longed for a career in the film industry, Elizabeth struggled to find steady work. She lived a transient lifestyle, relying on friends and acquaintances for places to stay. Despite her struggles, Elizabeth had a magnetic personality that drew people to her. She was described as charming, kind, and full of life. She loved wearing black clothing, which gave her an air of sophistication and mystery. Her style eventually inspired the nickname, the Black Dahlia, which the press would later immortalize. Elizabeth's life was marked by moments of excitement, but also uncertainty. She had several romantic relationships, often with military men she met during World War II. Her connection to servicemen gave her access to the vibrant social scene of the time, but it also meant her life was often unstable. She moved frequently and was known to travel between cities, staying briefly in places like San Diego and Santa Barbara. One notable moment in Elizabeth's life came in 1943 when she was arrested in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. The police took her mugshot, a haunting image that would resurface years later after her death. Following her arrest, she was sent back to Massachusetts by the authorities. However, her restless spirit brought her back to California before long. Elizabeth's life in Los Angeles was far from the glamorous Hollywood dream she had envisioned. By the time of her death, she was living in precarious conditions, moving between cheap hotels and relying on others for support. Yet, she remained determined to achieve her goals, even as the odds seemed stacked against her. Those who knew Elizabeth remember her as a young woman full of potential. She had a smile and a lively spirit, despite the hardships she faced. She was often seen as a symbol of hope and ambition, embodying the dreams of countless young women who came to Hollywood searching for fame. But behind the outward charm and beauty was a vulnerable person trying to find her place in a world that could be unforgiving. Elizabeth's story is one of resilience and determination, but it's also a tragic reminder of how easily dreams can be shattered. By the time Elizabeth Short's life ended so violently, she had become a familiar face to many in Los Angeles. But the mystery of who she really was, the person behind the glamour and the headlines, would be overshadowed by the shocking details of her death. The nickname Black Dahlia turned her into an icon, but the real Elizabeth Short was far more complex than the media portrayal. She was a young woman with hopes, struggles, and a desire to make her mark in the world. Elizabeth's life, though short, continues to be remembered. Her beauty and charm made her unforgettable to those who knew her, but it was the tragic circumstances of her death that cemented her place in history. Who was Elizabeth Short? To many, she was a mystery, but to those who loved her, she was a daughter, a friend, and a dreamer. Her story is one of unfulfilled potential, a life taken too soon, and a legacy that continues to captivate generations. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the scene of Elizabeth Short's murder, they were immediately faced with a complex and chilling case. The condition of her body, the lack of blood at the scene, and the meticulous way it had been staged all pointed to a crime that was carefully planned and carried out. From the very beginning, it was clear that this was no ordinary murder. The first challenge for investigators was identifying the victim. Elizabeth had no identification on her, and the case quickly became a top priority for the LAPD. Realizing the difficulty of the task ahead, they turned to the FBI for help. Within hours, Elizabeth's fingerprints were sent to the FBI's Washington, D.C. headquarters using a sound photo machine, a type of early fax technology. Despite the technology being primitive by today's standards, the FBI responded in record time. Just 56 minutes after receiving the prints, they matched them to Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth's fingerprints were in the FBI's database for two reasons. In 1943, she had applied for a job at Camp Cook, an Army base in California. That same year, she was arrested for underage drinking in Santa Barbara, and her mugshot and fingerprints were taken at that time. These records provided investigators with a name and some background, but little else to go on. Once Elizabeth was identified, the LAPD began piecing together her final days. They tracked down acquaintances, interviewed anyone who had been in contact with her, and followed up on every lead they could find. Elizabeth's transient lifestyle made the task more difficult, as she had no permanent address and relied on the generosity of friends and strangers for places to stay. Her movements in the days leading up to her death were uncertain, with conflicting reports about who she was with and where she had been. The brutality of the crime led detectives to believe the killer might have had medical knowledge. The precise way her body was cut suggested expertise in dissection. This theory prompted investigators to look into students and staff at the University of Southern California Medical School, but no clear suspects emerged. The lack of evidence at the scene left detectives frustrated. The killer had gone to great lengths to avoid leaving behind any clues. No blood, no murder weapon, and no witnesses. It was as if the perpetrator had vanished without a trace. Adding to the complexity of the case was the intense media interest. Reporters arrived at the crime scene before the police could fully secure it, taking photographs and publishing details that should have remained confidential. The press even received anonymous letters, some of which were believed to have been sent by the killer. One such letter included Elizabeth's birth certificate, personal photographs, and an address book, which were mailed in a package with words cut out from newspapers to form a taunting message. The package was wiped clean of fingerprints, except for one partial print that could not be matched to any known records. The FBI played a crucial role in supporting the LAPD. Agents ran background checks on potential suspects and interviewed people across the country who might have had information about the case. Despite their efforts, the investigation produced more questions than answers. Over 150 suspects were interviewed, ranging from local criminals to prominent figures, but none of them could be definitively tied to the crime. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the number of false leads and confessions. Several individuals came forward claiming responsibility for the murder, but none of their stories aligned with the evidence. Some sought attention, while others were mentally unstable. Each false lead drained resources and time from the investigators, adding to their growing frustration. The investigation also uncovered troubling details about Elizabeth's final days. Witnesses reported seeing her with different men, some of whom were known for violent behavior. However, these connections didn't lead to any arrests. The transient nature of Elizabeth's life meant that many people she encountered were difficult to trace. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, the trail grew colder with each passing week. As the months went by, the pressure on the LAPD and FBI intensified. The public demanded answers, and the media continued to sensationalize the case. Detectives reviewed every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and followed up on new tips. But the case remained unsolved. The lack of a clear motive, coupled with the deliberate staging of Elizabeth's body, suggested that the killer might have been driven by something deeply personal or even pathological. While investigators worked tirelessly, the case was plagued by setbacks. The interference of the press, the sheer number of false leads, and the limited forensic technology of the time made solving the murder an uphill battle. Fingerprint analysis, while advanced for the era, could only go so far without matching prints. DNA testing, which might have cracked the case today, was decades away from being developed. Despite their best efforts, the LAPD and FBI were unable to identify the killer. The case officially went cold, but it never faded from the public's consciousness. Over the years, it would inspire countless books, movies, and theories, each offering a different perspective on what might have happened to Elizabeth Short. The investigation into the Black Dahlia murder was one of the largest and most challenging of its time. It showcased the dedication of law enforcement, while also highlighting the limitations of the tools and resources available to them. Elizabeth's case remains one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in history, haunting reminder of how justice can sometimes remain just out of reach. The murder of Elizabeth Short, known as the Black Dahlia, is one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in history. Over the decades, numerous theories and suspects have emerged, each adding a new layer to the mystery. While some leads seemed promising, none have led to a definitive answer. Here, we look at the most compelling theories and individuals who were thought to be involved. One of the first observations made by investigators was the precision of the cuts on Elizabeth's body. The clean separation at the waist and the absence of jagged edges suggested that the killer had a high level of skill in anatomy or surgery. This led detectives to suspect someone with medical training. Investigators focused on students and staff at the University of Southern California Medical School. They interviewed individuals who might have had access to surgical tools and knowledge of human anatomy. Despite their efforts, no solid suspects emerged. The theory of a medically trained killer remains one of the most plausible explanations, but it has never been proven. Shortly after Elizabeth's murder, a letter arrived at the offices of a Los Angeles newspaper. It was written in a taunting tone, with words and letters cut from magazines and newspapers. The letter claimed responsibility for the murder and contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, personal photographs, and an address book. It was signed, "The Black Dahlia Avenger." This package gave investigators hope that the killer might slip up and reveal themselves. They found a single partial fingerprint on the letter, but it didn't match any prints in their database. The sender's identity remains unknown, leaving many to wonder if it was the actual killer or someone seeking attention. One of the first suspects was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner who was reportedly one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive. Hansen's name appeared in the address book sent with the anonymous letter. He was known to have offered Elizabeth a place to stay on occasion, and some reports suggested that he may have had romantic feelings for her, which she did not reciprocate. While Hansen was cooperative with the investigation, some detectives believed he might have had a motive rooted in jealousy or rejection. However, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime, and he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy and influential physician, is one of the most controversial suspects in the case. Hodel's name came to light decades later, thanks to his son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective. In the early 2000s, Steve began investigating his father after discovering unsettling evidence in his family's belongings. Steve Hodel uncovered photographs of a woman who resembled Elizabeth Short in his father's possession. He also found that George Hodel had been accused of sexually assaulting his own daughter, which led to a trial. Though Hodel was acquitted, his behavior raised serious questions about his character. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from a secret recording made by the LAPD in the 1950s. While investigating Hodel for another crime, police bugged his home and recorded him saying, "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." The statement was suspicious, but it wasn't enough to charge him. Steve Hodel's theory gained significant media attention, and while many believe George Hodel could be the killer, others argue that the evidence is circumstantial. George Hodel died in 1999, leaving the questions surrounding him unanswered. Another suspect was Dr. Walter Bailey, a surgeon who lived near the location where Elizabeth's body was found. Bailey's daughter was a friend of Elizabeth's sister, which suggested a possible connection. His surgical background and proximity to the crime scene made him a person of interest. However, Bailey's age and declining health at the time of the murder raised doubts about his involvement. Investigators were unable to find any solid evidence linking him to the crime. Like many other suspects, Bailey was eventually ruled out, but his name continues to appear in discussions about the case. The Black Dahlia case captured the imagination of the public, and many private citizens sent tips and theories to the police. Some letters pointed to local criminals, while others accused strangers based on vague descriptions. One letter even claimed that a man with a distinctive tattoo was the killer, but the lead went nowhere. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. Sensationalized headlines and speculative reporting fueled theories that ranged from organized crime to a jealous lover seeking revenge. The press's interference often hindered the investigation, but it also kept the case in the public eye. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the sheer number of false confessions. Over the years, more than 50 people have claimed responsibility for Elizabeth Short's murder. Some of these confessions came from individuals seeking attention, while others were from people who were mentally ill. Each confession had to be thoroughly investigated, taking up valuable time and resources. None of the confessions matched the physical evidence or the timeline of Elizabeth's final days, further complicating the investigation. There are countless other theories about who killed Elizabeth Short. Some suggest she was the victim of a serial killer, while others believe the crime was an isolated act of violence. Speculation has also linked her death to powerful figures in Hollywood or the criminal underworld, though no evidence supports these claims. One popular theory is that the killer had a personal connection to Elizabeth. The staging of her body, the extreme violence, and the taunting letters suggest a crime fueled by anger or obsession. However, without concrete evidence, these ideas remain speculative. The Black Dahlia murder has baffled investigators for over 75 years. The lack of witnesses, physical evidence, and reliable leads made solving the case incredibly difficult. The press's involvement and the overwhelming number of false leads only added to the challenges faced by law enforcement. Advances in forensic science have solved many cold cases, but the Black Dahlia remains an exception. The evidence that could have been used for DNA testing has been lost or degraded over time, making it unlikely that the case will ever be solved. Theories about Elizabeth Short's murder continue to fascinate and frustrate both experts and amateur sleuths. While the true identity of her killer may never be known, the case serves as a haunting reminder of how some mysteries remain out of reach. The Black Dahlia story is one of ambition, tragedy, and the dark side of human natura's story that refuses to be forgotten. From the moment Elizabeth Short's murder was discovered, it became a media sensation. Newspapers across Los Angeles and the entire country seized on the gruesome details of the case, crafting headlines that shocked and captivated the public. The press turned Elizabeth into an overnight figure of intrigue, often focusing as much on her lifestyle and appearance as on the horrifying crime itself. The nickname Black Dahlia was coined by reporters shortly after the murder. It was inspired by Elizabeth's signature black clothing and the film The Blue Dahlia, a noir movie that had been released the year before. The nickname added an air of mystery and allure to the case, and it stuck. From that moment on, Elizabeth Short wasn't just a murder victim. She became a symbol of a dark and twisted Hollywood underbelly. The media's obsession with the Black Dahlia case led to intense competition among news outlets to get exclusive details. Reporters flooded the crime scene before the police could properly secure it, taking photos and spreading information that should have remained confidential. In some cases, the press even fabricated stories to keep the public engaged. These sensationalized reports often focused on Elizabeth's personal life, portraying her as a femme fatale and exaggerating her connections to the Hollywood elite. The intense scrutiny on Elizabeth's life led to a distorted image of who she really was. Reporters painted her as a mysterious, provocative figure who lived a life of intrigue. They speculated about her relationships, her movements in the days leading up to her death, and her supposed ties to powerful men. In reality, Elizabeth was a young woman trying to navigate a challenging and uncertain life, far from the glamorous character the media portrayed. This portrayal of Elizabeth Short was part of a broader trend in how women were depicted in the media during the time. Rather than focusing on the tragic circumstances of her death, reporters often cast blame on Elizabeth herself, suggesting that her lifestyle or choices had led to her murder. This victim-blaming narrative reflected societal attitudes of the era and added an additional layer of injustice to her story. The press's interference didn't just distort public perception, it also directly impacted the investigation. Detectives struggled to keep sensitive details of the case confidential. Anonymous letters claiming responsibility for the murder were often sent to newspapers instead of the police. Some of these letters were considered credible, while others were dismissed as hoaxes. The media's involvement blurred the lines between fact and fiction, making it even harder for law enforcement to separate real leads from distractions. The public's fascination with the Black Dahlia case reached fever pitch. People were captivated by the mystery, and Elizabeth's image became iconic. Her mugshot, which had been taken after her underage drinking arrest in 1943, was widely published, becoming one of the most recognizable photos associated with the case. This image, with her dark hair and striking features, added to the intrigue surrounding her life and death. The case also inspired countless amateur sleuths who sent tips and theories to the police. Some claimed to know the identity of the killer, while others offered vague or fantastical suggestions. While a few leads were followed up on, the majority were dead ends. The overwhelming amount of information coming from the public and the press often slowed the investigation rather than helping it. The Black Dahlia case became more than just a murder investigation. It turned into a cultural phenomenon. Newspapers published updates for weeks, and even years later, the case continued to appear in headlines. It inspired books, films, and even urban legends, each adding to the mythos surrounding Elizabeth Short's life and death. The public's fascination with the case spoke to a larger obsession with crime, mystery, and the darker side of human nature. While the media played a significant role in keeping the case in the public eye, it also contributed to the sensationalism that clouded the investigation. Elizabeth Short became more of a character than a real person, her life overshadowed by the gruesome details of her death. Even today, the Black Dahlia case is remembered as much for the media frenzy it caused as for the tragedy at its center. The way the press handled Elizabeth's story serves as a reminder of the power and responsibility of the media. The public's obsession with her case may have kept it alive in cultural memory, but it also came at the cost of turning a victim into a spectacle. Elizabeth Short's murder remains unsolved, but her story continues to be told, a reflection of both the fascination and the flaws of our collective response to tragedy. More than 75 years have passed since the brutal murder of Elizabeth Short, but the mystery surrounding her death remains as haunting as ever. The Black Dahlia case has become one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history, leaving countless questions unanswered and sparking endless speculation. From the start, the case baffled investigators. The crime scene was meticulously staged, with no blood or physical evidence to indicate where the murder had occurred. The precision with which Elizabeth's body was cut and arranged suggested a level of planning and skill rarely seen in violent crimes. These unsettling details made it clear that the killer had taken extraordinary steps to conceal their identity while ensuring the body would be found. The lack of solid evidence made it nearly impossible for detectives to build a strong case against any of the suspects. While the police and FBI followed hundreds of leads, every promising trail eventually went cold. Even as new suspects emerged over the years, none could be definitively linked to the crime. The sheer complexity of the case raised the chilling possibility that the killer had outsmarted law enforcement. One of the enduring mysteries of the case is the killer's motive. Was it personal? Did the killer know Elizabeth? Or was she chosen at random? The brutality of the crime suggests deep anger or hatred, but the staging of her body hints at a desire to send a message. Theories about the motive range from jealousy and revenge to the possibility of a sadistic thrill kill. Yet, without more evidence, these remain just theories. The killer's ability to avoid detection also raises questions about who they were. The precise dissection of Elizabeth's body led many to believe the killer had medical knowledge. This theory is supported by the clean cuts and lack of hesitation marks, which indicate a steady hand and familiarity with anatomy. But if the killer was someone in the medical field, why risk everything by committing such a high-profile murder? Another possibility is that the killer had connections to law enforcement or the criminal underworld. Some theorists suggest that someone with such connections might have been able to manipulate the investigation or avoid detection altogether. While this idea is intriguing, there is no concrete evidence to support it. The media's role in shaping the Black Dahlia case has also contributed to its enduring mystery. Sensationalized headlines and speculative reporting blurred the line between fact and fiction. Some details published by the press were outright fabrications, while others were exaggerated or misinterpreted. This flood of misinformation made it difficult to separate credible evidence from rumor, further complicating the case. Over the years, the Black Dahlia case has inspired countless theories, books, and documentaries. One of the most debated theories comes from Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective who believes his father, Dr. George Hodel, was the killer. Steve's investigation into his father's life uncovered chilling evidence, including statements made by George that seemed to implicate himself. While many find Steve Hodel's case compelling, critics argue that it is based largely on circumstantial evidence. Other theories suggest Elizabeth may have been the victim of a serial killer. Her murder shares some similarities with other unsolved crimes from the same era, including the Cleveland torso murders and the lipstick killer case. However, no definitive links between these cases and Elizabeth's murder have been established. As time passes, the likelihood of solving the Black Dahlia case grows slimmer. Key witnesses and suspects have passed away, and much of the original evidence has been lost or degraded. Modern forensic techniques, such as DNA analysis, could have provided valuable insights, but the technology did not exist at the time of the investigation. Without new evidence or a confession, the case may remain unsolved forever. Despite the lack of resolution, the Black Dahlia case continues to captivate the public. It has become more than just a crime, it's a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of Hollywood's darker side, and a reminder of the fragility of justice. The haunting image of Elizabeth Short, her tragic life, and the brutal nature of her death resonate with people on a deeply emotional level. The mystery of the Black Dahlia endures not only because it remains unsolved, but because it touches on themes that are universally compelling: violence, ambition, loss, and the search for truth. Elizabeth Short's story is a reminder that some questions may never have answers, no matter how much time or effort is devoted to finding them. As the years go by, the case becomes less about finding justice for Elizabeth and more about understanding why it continues to matter. The Black Dahlia represents a moment in history where tragedy and mystery collided, leaving a legacy that refuses to fade. Whether the killer's identity is ever revealed or not, the story of Elizabeth Short will continue to be told, ensuring that her name and her memory will never be forgotten. The murder of Elizabeth Short, known as the Black Dahlia, left a mark not only on the city of Los Angeles, but also on the collective consciousness of society. Over the decades, her story has evolved into a cultural phenomenon, influencing art, literature, film, and the true crime genre in ways few cases ever have. One of the reasons the Black Dahlia case continues to resonate is the stark contrast between Elizabeth's life and her death. As a young woman with dreams of Hollywood stardom, she symbolized ambition, beauty, and the hope of a brighter future. But her brutal murder and the grim details surrounding it exposed a darker side of the glamorous city, a place where dreams could easily turn into nightmares. This juxtaposition has made her story a compelling metaphor for the fragility of fame and the dangers of chasing it. The media played a pivotal role in cementing the Black Dahlia's place in popular culture. Sensationalized headlines and lurid stories about Elizabeth's life and death captivated readers and contributed to her posthumous fame. Over time, her name became synonymous with mystery and intrigue, a haunting reminder of how the press can transform a tragedy into a spectacle. The nickname Black Dahlia itself has become iconic, evoking images of 1940s Los Angeles, noir films, and the shadowy world of unsolved crimes. The case has inspired numerous works of fiction and nonfiction, including books, movies, and television shows. James Ellroy's novel, The Black Dahlia, and its film adaptation brought the story to a new generation, blending fact and fiction to explore the case's enduring mystery. In addition to its influence on storytelling, the Black Dahlia case has had a significant impact on the true crime genre. It is one of the earliest examples of a case where the public's fascination with crime and justice fueled widespread interest and engagement. This fascination laid the groundwork for modern true crime media, from documentaries to podcasts, which often explore the psychological and societal aspects of infamous cases like Elizabeth's. Elizabeth Short's story has also inspired countless artists and musicians. Her image and the mystery of her life have been reinterpreted in paintings, songs, and performances. These creative works often reflect on the themes of loss, violence, and the fleeting nature of beauty, keeping her memory alive in ways that go beyond the details of her death. While the Black Dahlia case has contributed to the growth of true crime as a genre, It has also sparked important discussions about victim portrayal. Elizabeth's life was often sensationalized, with the media focusing on her appearance, lifestyle, and relationships, rather than the injustice of her murder. Modern discussions about the case highlight the need to respect victims and their stories, ensuring that they are remembered as people rather than as symbols or headlines. More than 7 decades later, the Black Dahlia remains a symbol of mystery and tragedy. Elizabeth Short's murder, though unsolved, continues to provoke questions about justice, media ethics, and the darker side of human nature. Her story reminds us of the importance of preserving the dignity of those whose lives are cut short, even as we seek to understand the mysteries surrounding them. Elizabeth Short's legacy is one of a life unfinished, a story that has transcended time. Her name lives on, not just as a tragic headline, but as a lasting reminder of the power of storytelling and the cultural impact of unsolved mysteries. Through art, media, and ongoing interest in her case, the Black Dahlia has become immortal, ensuring that her story will never be forgotten. Elizabeth Short's story, forever tied to the name Black Dahlia, is more than just a tale of tragedy and mystery. It is a reflection of a time and place where ambition and danger collided, where the allure of Hollywood's bright lights masked the shadows lurking beneath. The gruesome details of her murder have haunted generations, but the true depth of this case lies in the unanswered questions that remain. Who killed Elizabeth Short, and why? Was it a calculated act by someone who knew her, or was she simply an unfortunate victim of a random, brutal crime? These questions linger, adding to the chilling allure of her story. For investigators, the case was a sobering reminder of the limitations of justice. Despite the best efforts of the LAPD, FBI, and countless detectives over the decades, Elizabeth's killer was never found. Advances in forensic science and modern technology might have solved the case today, but back in 1947, the tools available were far too limited. The passage of time has only made the mystery harder to solve, as evidence has degraded and key witnesses and suspects have passed away. For the public, the Black Dahlia case has become a symbol of intrigue and obsession. It represents our fascination with the unknown and our desire to make sense of the senseless. But as much as the mystery captivates, it also highlights important issues such as media ethics and the way society treats victims. Elizabeth's life was often overshadowed by the grisly details of her death, and the media's portrayal of her as a femme fatale rather than a vulnerable young woman is a stark reminder of how narratives can be shaped. Elizabeth Short was more than the headlines and the nickname. She was a 22-year-old with hopes, dreams, and challenges, just like anyone else. Her story reminds us to look beyond the sensationalism and to honor her as a person whose life was tragically cut short. As we reflect on the Black Dahlia case, we are left with the reality that some mysteries may never be solved. Yet, Elizabeth Short's story continues to be told, ensuring that she is remembered not just for how she died, but for the enduring impact of her life. The Black Dahlia is not just a case, it's a legacy, a reminder of the fragility of life, and a symbol of a story that refuses to fade, even after all these years.